Chapter 7. Gerald Osterwald didn't like Ursula, sector capital or no. The planet, as all the planets in the frontier sectors, was terminally uncultured. He preferred the civilized amenities and pleasures of the core worlds. Yet he comforted himself with the reflection that his task here was worth temporary inconveniences. He supposed it really wasn't necessary for Galcorp to own the entire Santa Cruz system, but they certainly needed to own enough of it to control the rest, and the original planetary charter had made that difficult. Virgin as much of the planet might still be, most of it was already owned by some descendant of the original colonist or set aside nature reserves held by the planetary government. Certainly all the choicest bits and pieces were, and Galcorp hadn't become the third largest transstellar corporation of the Concordiat by settling for leftovers. Unfortunately, his mother had been correct in at least one respect. His original bootleg copy of Ursula Central's records on the planet had been less complete than he'd thought. Central had updated itself considerably in the 18 months since he'd first obtained access to its files. It seemed Santa Cruz would be a tougher nut for a messy solution than he'd originally anticipated. The fact that the local yokel militia had no less than 14 Wolverine heavy tanks was unfortunate, but formidable as the Wolverines had been in their day, they were also 70 or 80 years out of date. They could have been dealt with fairly easily if not for the real joker he'd never anticipated of fighting in this deck. A Bolo. What in the name of sanity was a Bolo doing on a backwoods farming planet? More to the point, how did he go about neutralizing it? Despite his original airy confidence, he knew his mother's maternal feelings would not suffice to preserve his present clear right of succession to Galcorp's throne if he blew this operation. But discovering a Bolo in the mix made things far more complicated. He sat in the lounge of his palatial hyper yacht, while options revolved in his brain. One did not normally, as humanity's enemies had discovered in the last 700 years or so, employ brute force solutions against a Bolo with any probability of success. Of course, this Bolo was out of date as the militia's Wolverines, but obsolescent was a purely relative concept where Bolos were concerned. No. If he was going to pull this off, he required a more subtle approach. And it was possible he had just one. Bolos might be incorruptible, but same, alas, not could always be said for the people who built or commanded them. Yet, even if he could somehow neutralize the Bolo, he would still require someone with the will, the experience, and the resources to deal with the militia's overaged armored element. There were plenty of mercenary outfits with the last two qualities, but finding one which was willing to undertake the operation in the first place might prove difficult. The Concordiat Navy would be extremely unhappy with them, and if any planetary survivor could identify them afterwards, unhappiness on the Navy's part could all too easily prove fatal. What he needed was an outfit with minimal scruples and maximum need. One whose greed for the sort of clandestine support Galcorp could provide would overcome both any lingering humanitarian principles and fear of the Navy's potential response. Finding it wouldn't be easy, he admitted to himself, but he had some time. Survey Command moved with glacial slowness when it came to certifying jump lanes. By his most pessimistic estimate, it would be another T-year before the galaxy at large got the information Galcorp had already obtained. That gave him 6 or 7 months to get things organized, and it would probably take that time most to find the Bolo's Achilles heel anyway. He nodded to himself as he brought his encrypted comm online. The first step was to call home and get Mother's research teams started on finding the contacts he needed. Chapter 8. The subterranean rumble of an earthquake shook the jungle as the enormous door covering on the depot's vehicle ramp swept ponderously wide for the first time in 80 years. The patient, insatiable incursions of creepers and small trees had mounted 2 meters of spongy earth over the doors, and the birds screamed in alarm as the very ground parted with huge tearing sounds. Trees, some of them 10 and 20 meters tall, toppled in slow motion as the gaping wounds snapped roots like threads, and then with the rumble of mighty engines, the squeak of sprockets, and the grating clash of treads, Nike moved majestically into the light. The alloy Leviathan paused for a moment, optic head swiveling to scan its surroundings, and Paul Merritt felt a thrill he hadn't felt in years as he rode Nike's crash couch. No self-aware Bolo needed an onboard commander, but there was always an indescribable sense of communion. an adrenaline-charged exhilaration, the first time an officer of the Dinochrome Brigade rode his command's unstoppable power. And that feeling had never been stronger than it was today, for Nike was like no Bolo that he had ever commanded. Marina Stravakia's unauthorized modifications to this cart team's original brain box design had gone far deeper than he'd first realized. She hadn't stopped with making Nike fully autonomous. She'd taken the step no other Bolo tech had even dared yet, and given her creation, her child, genuine emotions. Nike just wasn't a machine. However magnificent, she was a person, and Merritt could feel her delight as direct sunlight bathed her hull at long last. She stood a moment longer, the humming rumble of her idling engines vibrating through her mammoth hull, like the purr of some enormous cat, then moved forward and pivoted regally to port. Her designers had given her the usual Bolo wide-track suspension, and no less than 8 separate tread systems, each with its own powertrain, and 5 tracks 5 meters wide supported her massive bulk. Independent quadruple fore and aft suspensions took her weight, spreading it out to reduce its ground pressure to an absolute minimum, and even so, her track sank well over a meter into the damp, rich soil. She forged ahead, plowing through the jungle like the juggernaut she was, and forest titans toppled like straws before her, while the occasional outcrops of solid rock powdered under her treads. Merritt said nothing. Nike knew where they were going, not that it would be any more than a brief jaunt around the depot's immediate area, and he had no wish to intrude upon her pleasure. No doubt the psych types would be all hot and bothered over that as well, but Paul Merritt had it up to the eyebrows with the brigade's psych ops and their potential consternation that mattered not at all to him. No, that quite wasn't true. He would be delighted if it caused them all to drop dead of cardiac arrest right on the spot. Nike was moving barely 20 kilometers per hour, far too slow a speed to require his couch's independent shock absorbers or crash frame, but he felt the gentle undulation of her suspension and grinned as he cocked the couch back in its gimbals. If anyone asked, not that they were likely to, he could justify his actions easily enough. Unit 0075 NKE had been on secondary power from the depot's systems for 8 decades. The test of its running gear and fusion plants was long overdue. And if he had other motives of his own, those were his business, not PsyOps. Another huge tree toppled, and as it fell, one of the large-scaled lizard cats, the most feared predators in Santa Cruz, suddenly leapt into sight. It crouched before them, staring in disbelief at the enormous intruder in its domain, then screamed its challenge and charged at the moving mountain of alloy. Merritt couldn't believe it. A lizard cat was 4 sinuous meters of vicious fighting power, the absolute ruler of Santa Cruz's jungles, but surely not even one of them could think it could stop a Bolo, yet the cat kept coming. He opened his mouth, but Nike halted abruptly on her own before he could even get the order out. The main fire control screen was slaved to her forward optical head, and Merritt frowned as it swept past the lizard cat, now ripping futilely at one of her stopped treads with its 8-centimeter claws. Ranging bars flickered, closing in on something in the center of the display. He inhaled in surprise as he realized what that something was. 4 scaled shapes, far smaller than the monster trying to savage Nike. They revealed where the roots of the falling tree had torn out the side of a subterranean den. They were almost as large as Merritt himself, perhaps, yet that was tiny compared to a mature lizard cat, and they turned blind, terrified eyes toward the snarling fury of their dame. The display focused on them for a moment, and then Nike moved slowly backwards. The lizard cat tried to fling itself onto the moving tread, only to tumble backward with a squall of pain as the Bolo brought up her kinetic interdiction battle screen. She must have had it on the lowest possible power setting, since it hadn't splattered the cat all over the jungle, but it was sufficient to throw the scaly mother safely away from her treads. The lizard cat heaved herself groggily to her feet, swaying for balance, then howled in victory as the threat to her young gave ground. Nike retreated a full 100 meters, then pivoted to her left and circled wide. Merritt shook his head with a wondering smile. Any other Bolo simply would have kept going. Even if it had realized the den lay in its path, that wouldn't have mattered to it. No other Bolo he ever served with would have even wondered why the cat had attacked in the first place, much less acted to preserve both mother and children. The Bolo started forward once more, skirting the den, and as he patted the couch arm, "Nice move, Nike, but how'd you guess? I just thought the critter was out of its mind." I have not previously personally encountered a lizard cat, but the depot's computers are tied to the planetary data net. I have thus been able to amass considerable data on Santa Cruzian life forms, yet none of the records available to me suggest a reason for a lizard cat to attack me. I am neither edible nor small enough for it to hope to kill me. As such, it could not regard me as prey, and lizard cats are less territorial than most large predators. They are noted for their intelligence, and faced with a foe of my size and power, the only intelligent choice would have been for the creature to flee, yet it did not. Thus, the only logical basis for its actions was that it perceived me as a threat it could not evade, yet the lizard cat itself manifestly could have evaded me. That suggested a protective reaction on its part, not one of aggression, and in turn suggested investigation to determine the nature of which it sought to protect. Merritt shook his head, eyes shining as he listened to the explanation no other Bolo would have been capable of making. I follow your logic, but why stop? Your tone suggests what Major Stravakis called a trick question, Commander. Are you in fact seeking to test me? I suppose I am, but the question still stands. Why didn't you just keep going? There was no need to do so, Commander. No time parameter had been set for this exercise, and avoiding the creature's den presents no inherent difficulty. That's an explanation of the consequences, Nike. Why did you not consider even continuing straight forward? He watched an auxiliary display as the mother lizard cat, still snarling after the threat to her cubs, retreated into her half-ruined den, and Nike moved smoothly along her way for perhaps 5 seconds before she replied. I did not wish to, Commander. There was no need to destroy that creature or her young, and I did not desire to do so. It would have been wrong. Compassion, Nike, for an animal? There was another moment of silence. When the Bolo spoke once more, it was not in a direct answer. We slicket, cowrin, timroust beastie, oh what panics in thy breastie. Thou needest a start away a hasty, we bickering brattle. I wad now lay with chase thee, we murdering prattle. What was that? Merritt wondered aloud. A poem, Commander. More precisely, the first verse of a poem, To a Mouse, by Robert Burns, a poet of old earth. Poetry, Nike? Merritt stared at the command console in disbelief, and the speaker made a small, soft sound that could only be called a laugh. Indeed, Commander. Major Stravakis was a great devotee of the humanities' pre-space poets. My earliest memory here on Santa Cruz is of her reading Homer to me. She read poetry to you? She didn't just feed it into your memory? She did that as well after I requested her to do so. Yet I believe she was correct in not to do so immediately. It was her belief that poetry is a social as well as a creative art, a mode of communication which distills the critical essence of the author's emotions and meaning and makes them transferable to another. As such, it reaches its fullest potential only when shared, knowingly and consciously. Indeed, I believe it was the act of sharing that makes poetry what Major Stravakis called a soul transfusion, and it was her hope that sharing it with me would complete the task of enabling the emotional aspects of my personality center. And did it? I am not certain. I have attempted to compute the probability that my emotions and those of a human are indeed comparable, yet I have been unable to do so. My evaluations lack critical data in that I do not know if I in fact have what humans call a soul, Commander, but if I do, then the poetry speaks directly to it. My God. Nike, this is a direct order. Do not discuss poetry, your emotion, or souls with anyone without my express authorization. Acknowledged, Commander. Your order is logged, Commander. Am I permitted to inquire as to the reason for it? You most certainly are. And then he ran a hand through his hair and shook his head. This entire conversation comes under the heading of aberrant behavior for a Bolo, Nike. Any Bolo tech would hit every alarm button in sight if he heard you saying things like that. And as soon as he did, they'd shut you down. They'd probably settle for removing your brain from your hull for further study, but I can't even be positive on that. Are you instructing me to deceive our superiors, Commander? Nike's tone was undeniably uncomfortable, and Merritt closed his eyes for a moment. I'm instructing you not to advertise your capabilities until I've got a handle on the, unauthorized modifications Major Stravakis has made to you. In my judgment, you represent an enormous advance in psychotronic technology which must be carefully studied and evaluated. But before I risk trying to convince anyone else of that, I need a better understanding of, well, you on my own. In the meantime, I don't want you saying or doing anything that might prompt some uninformed mental pygmy to wipe your personality center in a fit of panic. The Bolo forged ahead in silence for some moments while she pondered his explanation, and then the green light under the speaker blinked. Thank you for the explanation, Captain Merritt. You are my commander, and the order does not contravene any of the regulations in my memory. As such, I will of course obey it. And you understand the reasoning behind it? I do, Commander. Nike's voice was much softer this time, and Merritt sighed in relief. He relaxed in his couch, watching the screens as the Bolo slid unstoppably through the jungle, and he smiled. Good, Nike. In the meantime, why not read me a little more poetry? Of course, Commander. Do you have a preferred author? I'm afraid I don't know any poems, Nike, much less poets. Perhaps you should select something for me. There was another moment of silence as the Bolo considered her library memory, and then the speaker made the sound of a politely cleared throat. Do you speak Greek, Commander? Greek? Afraid not there, Nike. In that case, I shall defer the Iliad for the present. She pondered for a moment, a very long moment for a Bolo, and then, as you are a soldier, perhaps you will appreciate this selection. I went in the public house to get a pint of beer. The publican up and says, we serve no redcoats here. The girls behind the bar, they laughed and giggled a fit to die. I out to the streets again and says myself to I. Oh, it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away. But it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. The band begins to play, my boys, the band begins to play. Oh, it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. The mighty war machine rolled on through the jungle, and Paul Merritt leaned back in his crash couch and listened only half-believing delight as the ancient word of Kipling's timeless protest for all soldiers flowed from Nike's speaker.